Hello everybody and welcome to this Flutter versus React Native versus native mobile development video where today we're going to be we're comparing the, I would say, three main ways of creating your mobile applications. And that is, of course, using Flutter, React Native, and just, creating two separate applications, each for their respective operating system, iOS and Android. So my name is Arseni. I am a content creator for Eduonix Tech. And I hope you enjoy this video. So anyway, without further ado, let's jump right in. Okay, so let's start off by talking a little bit about what each framework is, or not really framework, methodology, what each methodology is for creating a mobile development application. Mobile application. There we go, finally got that out. So let's start off by talking a little bit about Flutter, in case you don't know. So Flutter is actually a cross-platform framework for developing mobile applications. It's actually created by Google. So we have this tech giant that created their own sort of mobile development framework, and it's written in Dart, which is a programming language that was also developed by Google, and it is both written in Dart, and we also write applications for it in Dart as well. Of course, it is also written with the with the C++ engine, which actually does give it a slight performance advantage, not advancement, Jesus Christ. But yeah, you get the idea. That's actually what Flutter is. By the way, it's written with a focus on performance. It adapts the reactive programming style, so essentially a reactive framework. And it also has its own built-in custom widgets, and I'm pretty sure that it is the only actual framework out there that has these custom widgets built in. Okay, and the second strategy or framework that we have for developing cross-platform mobile applications is called React Native. So React Native is a cross-platform mobile development framework. That's really hard to get out. That's actually developed by Facebook. So we have these two tech giants, each with their own cross-platform mobile development frameworks, which are and they're sort of competing to see who can create the best one. By the way, spoiler alert, right now React Native is a lot more popular than Flutter. So yeah, but we're going to talk a little bit more about that later on once we get to maturity of these frameworks. So React Native is we write React Native applications in JavaScript, and they can actually be different types of applications. So we can have a HTML5 application, we can have a mobile web application, and we can have a hybrid application. And these are all sort of written in React Native. And the difference there, the difference I would say between them is that some of them, most notably hybrid applications, sort of work closer with the operating system itself than others. But then others are a little bit less complex to write. So that's what I would say is the difference. So React Native actually is very similar to React.js. So React.js is Facebook's web framework, web front-end development framework. There we go. It's so difficult to get remembering all these names. Anyway, so yeah, React.js is Facebook's front-end development framework. And it actually is, writing React Native applications is very similar to writing React.js applications. And that actually gives React Native an advantage because there are a ton of developers who already know React.js, and they're going to feel very comfortable working with React Native since it's also written in JavaScript and very similar to writing React.js. There we go. Okay, so React Native offers hot reloading, much like Flutter does, by the way. It also allows you to mix native and React Native code. So if at any point sort of you don't like maybe your React Native code is taking too long or not working correctly on a certain operating system, you can just go ahead and just replace that with actual native code. And that way you do have to write it for iOS and Android separately, but you do get the benefit of it actually being native code and it working exactly how the developer of the operating system wanted it to. So that's essentially what I would say. So that's sort of React Native. And then finally, we have our last development strategy, which is just using the native way of developing. So for iOS, that's downloading Xcode and just creating an application that way. And for Android, it's just downloading Android Studio and using Java or Kotlin to actually create your application. And for iOS, it's Swift as well, or Objective-C. So yeah, and then just submitting them to the App Store. But we can also use a framework like React Native or Flutter. And one last thing that I'm going to say in this overview is that we can totally actually use, there are other frameworks as well for cross-platform development, but I would say these are the two main ones, and these are most definitely the two popular ones, or at least that I would use. The other ones, I just don't think they are, built well enough for me to actually use them. Okay, and that is actually all for the overview. Now let's actually go ahead and go into our first category, where we're going to have all three of these methodologies go, head to head to compete for the best strategy. Okay, so the first thing that we're going to take a look at in comparing these frameworks is speed, and I would say personally that this is probably the most important thing, or at least it's tied with the interface, because user interface, because nowadays people want two things in their applications mainly, and that's to have a pre-design and for it to actually work fast. And so that's what I would say is the most important part. And I'd say the winner of this category is most definitely just writing a native application. And you're going to see that the winner of a lot of these categories is going to be, just writing a native application, because native applications will always be faster pretty much no matter what, just because they're the most low level. We can communicate with the hardware directly. So, well, not quite directly. There's still a layer of abstraction that the actual developer of the software that develops these native applications sort of added. So we're not directly communicating with the hardware, but nevertheless, it is the closest communication with the hardware that we're essentially going to get when we're actually writing our code. Then in second place, I would say Flutter. So Flutter is almost most definitely, even in theory, Flutter is faster than React Native and should be faster than React Native, because it doesn't have a JavaScript bridge. So React Native sort of runs in JavaScript, and then at runtime, that JavaScript will actually call native components and redraw them essentially. Flutter doesn't have to do that. It just compiles down into the respective operating system's code. So that's Java for Android and Swift for iOS, and essentially after that, it can actually compile down to ARM code, and then that way it can actually run directly with the hardware itself, and so it most definitely is faster than React Native. It's not by much, but it is certainly visible in benchmarks and especially in large applications. Its actual engine is built in C++, which is most definitely responsible, or at least slightly responsible for its performance, advantage. You can see Google's confidence in the actual performance of Flutter, in it making the standard frames per second for an animation 60 FPS. So yeah, that's just something to know. There's 60 FPS animations by default. Okay, and then also in third place, running in dead last, we have React Native. So React Native, it essentially has to, well, as I talked just now about it, it essentially has to translate the code that is written in JavaScript to native machine code, which puts it at a disadvantage to Flutter in the speed department. So that definitely makes it run a little bit slower, especially in benchmarks. But when you are getting into real world performance, you see that the difference isn't that big. And then another thing to know also is that it doesn't have 60 frames per second animations. The default animations are actually 30 frames per second, but you can certainly do it by hooking up some third-party libraries, but you do have to jump through a few hoops while Flutter has it by default. So I'm gonna say one last thing, wrapping up this speed category. So the winner is definitely writing a native application, then it is Flutter, and then React Native. But what I will say is that when it comes down to it, all three of these ways are really well optimized, and 99% of the time, writing more efficient code is going to give a better performance increase than switching to a more efficient framework. So it's more on the so a developer optimizing his application will give a better performance increase than a developer of the framework optimizing his application. That's actually what I want to say finally to wrap up this first head-to-head match between these three strategies. Okay, and now let's also go ahead and take a look at the second category, where they're going to go head-to-head. and that is, of course, the look and feel of the actual, applications created in these respective strategies. Okay, and in this category, I would say native wins. I mean, this native applications, they're always going to have the look and feel that are consistent with the operating system itself. So, I mean, if you create an iOS app in, Xcode and Swift, it's most definitely, the components of it are most definitely going to look consistent with iOS. And the same thing for Android. If you develop an Android app, the components are going to look consistent. In second place, though, I'd say has to be Flutter. So we're just repeating the same thing as is with the first category. But yeah, Flutter actually has built-in widgets with their own style and customization options. So if this was more just for the look and feel close to native, then I say React Native would be better than Flutter, just because React Native doesn't actually have its own widget library. It uses more of the default widgets. Or, in React Native, it's components. But yeah, you get the idea. But essentially, I would say Flutter as a whole has a better look and feel and experience, just because it has its own widget library that you can then customize however you want. And it offers that customization. While React Native just sort of plops in the default, and you have to hook up some third-party libraries to actually maybe get some already built widgets for your application. And so yeah, then finally for one last thing I need to say about Flutter, though, the widgets it actually does have, they look a lot closer to Google's material design for Android, so it looks very consistent on Android. But then when you get into iOS, it doesn't look as consistent, just because Apple has a slightly different design methodology sort of than Google. So yeah, that's just something to note. But it does offer in many cases alternatives for iOS, just so you can make them, just that it looks consistent. And then finally, in third place, we have React Native. So React Native doesn't have its own built-in, widget or component library. It relies on third parties for that, but essentially that means that you essentially have to hook that up, and then the UI components, they look very close to native, but they are quite basic, though. So that is something to note as well. Okay, and that is actually all for the second category, which is look and feel. Now let's go into the third category, which is going to be maturity. Okay, so for maturity, I was debating whether or not to actually put this into the comparison or not, but then I realized that it is fairly important to have your framework actually be mature and have good tooling and things like that. So I decided to include it because, I mean, if you just want to develop something, but then there just isn't the resources to create it, well, not really resources, but just, libraries to create it, and you have to do it from scratch yourself, or if there just isn't documentation to how the library works, and so on and so on, it really is frustrating. So I decided to include it. And here also native most certainly wins, just because iOS has had over 9 years to create its app development ecosystem. Android has had over 8 years to create it, so they most certainly have had the longest amount of time to get rid of all the weirdness and bugs that go along with having a app store, essentially. So yeah, in second place, I would say here is React Native, unlike Flutter. So React Native was actually released in 2015, which means that as of 2018, it has just over 3 years, or actually no, just under 3 years of time to mature. And it is evident, in that there are a ton more React Native apps than there are Flutter apps. So that sort of makes sense. It also had an initial advantage that it was actually written in JavaScript, and there are a ton of JavaScript developers already out there, and it can actually oftentimes use JavaScript libraries and code in there. It's not quite simple, but you can do it, and if you have maybe a JavaScript library that doesn't have any actual UI components, you can certainly hook that up. And then in third place, of course, is Flutter, and I mean, it just hasn't had any time pretty much to mature. At the time of writing this, creating this video, the full version of Flutter isn't actually released. In fact, it just came out of beta about a week ago. Release Preview 1 actually came out. So right now it's on Release Preview 1. So again, it is most definitely the least mature. So this also means that it has a smaller community, a smaller amount of libraries, and there will also be less developers for it, which makes sense. But that said, with Flutter's current growth, I would be surprised if it doesn't catch up to React Native within the next few years. So that's my thoughts on the maturity. So if you definitely want the most mature strategy, then you're going to definitely go with just creating a native application. The second most mature, that's going to be React Native, and the least mature, I would say, is Flutter, which makes sense. It isn't even really released yet. So yeah. Anyway, then that's actually all for maturity. Let's now jump into our fourth category, which is going to be coding ease. Okay, so in terms of coding ease, most definitely, I would say the winner here has to be React Native. So, like Flutter, it's written in a reactive programming style, as we already did talk a little bit about. But React apps are written in JavaScript, which most certainly makes it much easier to be written if you know JavaScript. So the reason that I made it number one, though, is because I would say personally, if you know both frameworks, it's roughly the same. Maybe Flutter is a little bit easier to write if you have a large application. But nevertheless, the reason that I did make React Native win in this category is because there are just so many JavaScript developers out there, and there aren't a lot of Dart developers out there. So that's essentially why I decided to pick React Native as the winner here, just because if you do know JavaScript, which there's a higher chance that you do than Dart, a much higher chance that you do than Dart, then it will be quite easy to get up to speed pretty quickly. In second place here, we're going to have Flutter. So Flutter is written in Dart. It's a language that's quite familiar to, that will be quite familiar to programmers who already know things like Java, C++. Well, maybe not quite C++, but things like Golang, and it's quite close to JavaScript as well. So essentially, this does give it a bit of a disadvantage to React Native, for the reason that I just said before. So yeah, it wins. I'd say they're roughly the same, but React Native most certainly wins. Now, I will say if you don't know JavaScript, then most likely writing a Flutter application is going to be easier for you than writing a React Native application, just because JavaScript has its own separate quirks that are kind of weird. And then finally, in third place, we have native development. So native development, it's quite difficult to write, just because there isn't a layer of abstraction like there are in when you're writing these frameworks. So while I will say that writing these applications overall may be easier because you don't have to worry about a component not working on one operating system and not working on the other. You don't have to worry about that because it just won't work on the other operating system at all, and you have to write it twice essentially. So that's why I'm picking it last here, just because it's not that easy, and these frameworks most definitely do make it easier to write these applications. Okay, and finally moving on to our last category, which is going to be testing tools. Okay, so in terms of testing, the winner here is native again. So native testing will always, again, be better than using a framework to develop applications, just because native has had so much time to mature, essentially. And it has had a lot of time to develop these testing frameworks, and these testing of frameworks can work very closely with the hardware, since it is, of course, native. So I'm definitely giving native the win here, so which sort of makes sense. In second place, I would say is most likely going to be Flutter. So Flutter is it's written in Dart, which in itself has an excellent testing library already developed by Google. So it's covered there. But it also has a very nice integration testing library. So Flutter itself has a integration testing library that's also built by Google, and so that it definitely helps it be better in testing as well. And in third place, of course, going to be React Native. So React Native is written in JavaScript, and it is true that it is covered on the JavaScript front for just unit tests, because JavaScript, you can use all of the frameworks that are already developed for JavaScript with React Native. But if you do start going into testing the components of JavaScript and start testing maybe the integration test itself, it's gonna get more difficult. So it is most definitely doable. There's a library called Jest, which allows you to test the applications, but it is a third-party library, and most of the time third-party libraries do tend to work worse with some kind of software than if it was a first-party library. So if it was developed by the same people who developed the library itself. And so, yeah, so that wraps up testing tools, and that actually wraps up this general comparison video. So now let's get into the conclusion. Here I'm going to talk a little bit about my thoughts, what I would do. I've been developing apps for a while now, and personally for me today, I would see myself, as of right now, creating an application most likely in React Native. But, there's a very large but. First of all, if I was going to be creating this application, knowing that I would probably finish it maybe in a year from now, so if it was a very large application, I would most definitely do it in Flutter. And if I was to be creating an application, if I was going to be starting an application maybe 5 or 6 months from now, I would also be creating it only in Flutter, just because React Native, it gets very difficult to create applications as they start to grow in size. So, and that's actually my problem with React.js. So I definitely like Angular more, just because React.js, it's great if you want to develop like a very simple application with maybe like 3 screens and not a lot of code. But as soon as you start getting into some of the more complex stuff, you're gonna see it becomes quite difficult to keep everything organized in React.js. And in Angular, it most certainly is simpler. I also would choose Flutter over React Native because it has its own widgets library, so I don't have to, hook up some kind of third-party library. It has its own widgets library that I can customize and make it look how I want. And then not to mention the fact that Flutter is a little bit faster, so that's also, it's always nice to get at least a little bit of that. Even if a developer optimization that's developing the application matters more, it's always nice to save yourself a little bit of work and then maybe just, allow yourself to not optimize one chunk, save some time, and have it still be quite fast. Native still is very valid. I don't think native development is going anywhere. If you are developing an application that is going to serve millions of people, you want it to be as fast, look as great as possible, and maybe you're not quite worried about development time, ease of development, I would certainly choose native as well. So it's also very valid. It's also and if especially if you're creating a complex application, because both the React Native and Flutter do have trouble actually communicating with the actual hardware APIs at a lower level. So at a higher level, no problem, but as soon as you start to get a little bit at a lower level, they most definitely do have problems with that. So yeah, native development also not going anywhere, but as of right now, today, if I was to be creating just a very basic, maybe medium-sized application, most definitely go for React Native as of now. And okay, that actually wraps up this comparison video between these 3 mobile development strategies. Do you agree or do you disagree with my opinions? Be sure to leave it in the comment section below. Be sure to also like, comment, and subscribe. I just said to comment, but comment twice. Why not? Why not? Are you busy? Are you going somewhere? Comment twice. Anyway, this has been Arseny from Eduonix Tech. Make sure to check out some of my other videos on Eduonix Tech. There are also other videos that aren't my videos. My videos are, of course, superior. I make sure to always say that my videos are superior because, they are. But be sure to feel free to check them out as well. The other videos are also very, very good. Anyway, this has been Arseny for Eduonix Tech. Thank you very much for watching. Till soon.